To introduce our guest lecturer today. So this gentleman traveled from New York City to Ithaca, New York today. He went on the famed Cornell bus. He got on at the Cornell Club. He's big into social media. He took a picture of the Cornell Club. That's why I know he was there, and he pasted it on his Facebook page. Let me tell you a little bit about this guy. I first met this guy over 20 years ago when I hired him to work for me at the University of Rochester. He was a graduate of Texas A&M in College Station, Texas, and where he studied rhetoric and the kind of things that we teach in this class. Isn't that true? Yeah. And so then I hired him, and I was like, at the time he was doing all kinds of odd jobs, and I'm like, quit those jobs, move to Rochester, New York, and meet me at this place, and I've arranged for you to have a room in this house. And so he drove up, like he put all his belongings in a U-Haul, and he drove up from Texas, and I realized after the fact I gave him the wrong address. So the actual address, you put it into his phone at the time. I think they had GPS.
Well, we didn't.
Probably
had like a printed out map.
Yeah, like a MapQuest, and so the address I gave him was an empty lot. And so he pulls up. It was close to the right address, but he pulls up, and I see him get out of I'm on the porch of the place he's supposed to be, and I see him get out and look at this empty lot, and I could read on his face, he just thought he got scammed. Like someone had convinced him that they had given him a job, and he had taken all his belongings, rented a van, and now he was at this empty lot in the middle of Rochester, New York. And then I was like, hey, are you Stephen Yano? And he's like, yes. And I'm like, you haven't been scammed. And then, the rest is history. We became friends, as well as coworkers. We became friends. And then I was instrumental in getting him interested in going to graduate school and helping him get into graduate school at one of the top master's programs in rhetoric in the U.S., the same place I went to, at Syracuse University. And he went there. He was very successful. And then he got his Ph.D. in rhetoric, what we teach in this class, at the University of Pittsburgh, which is also one of the top programs. Since that, he's had a number of different jobs, but currently he's an associate tenured professor at St. John's University in Queens, New York. And he is a well-known name in the debate world. He's had a lot of academic success, and he even has a podcast, which I highly recommend.
Who doesn't? What? All of you have a podcast.
I don't have a podcast. Okay, but what is your podcast called?
It's called In the Bin.
In the Bin, and I'll tell you that's a debate reference. So at some debate tournaments, you judge as well as you compete. But if you're either considered a poor judge or a bad debater, right, they kind of put you down lower and lower in the competition. So you're kind of debating people that aren't so good with not so good records, and you're also judging those debates because you're not considered not that great. And so that's called in the bin, like in the garbage. And it's it's very British parliamentary debate. It's kind of, the bin is what British call a garbage can. So I thought it was funny that he had a podcast about argumentation and debate that he named In the Bin. And what do you talk about on the podcast?
Garbage arguments.
Garbage arguments? No, that's not
Good
true.
ones too. We talk about argument, debate, rhetoric.
All kinds of things.
Yeah, all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Anything involving
Go ahead.
what we're going to talk about tonight. Anything
Oh, really?
We're going to talk about tonight.
All right. Anything about rhetoric, debate, argument?
Theory, practice, political rhetoric, speeches, pretty much anything.
Yeah.
It's pretty open.
Yeah. And so, anyway, so it's always really nice. I haven't seen this guy in person since before COVID.
Yeah.
And he's a really, really, really close friend. And so it was really nice. Right before we came in here, I took him over to the Statler, cleaned him up, got him a shower, got him a nice meal, and he's ready to go. And so it's always nice to put a man back on his feet. Let's hear it for Stephen Yano.
Okay, thanks for having me in your class. What time are we done, Sam? What time do they?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. Okay.
But this group will go till whenever.
Oh no, we're not going past 10 o'clock. thanks for letting me come into your class to talk about something I love. I've been studying rhetoric ever since I was an undergraduate, just like you. This is when I discovered it. So it might be your night where you discover rhetoric, and it kind of takes over your thinking process, I hope. So let's start with common understandings, if this will work. Yeah. What do you think rhetoric is? We used this term several times already. What do you think it is? You can take a second to kind of reflect on it. I'm sure you've heard this word before. You signed up for a class with rhetoric in the title. Maybe you Googled it. I don't know. But what is your understanding of what this word means?
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
So I always know, sometimes students come to me and they're like, oh yeah, I come to class all the time. And they're like, I'm like, which class are you talking in? And they're like, the Rhetoric.
Oh, the Rhetorical, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, it's not pronounced Rhetoric.
It's the epitome of mispronunciations.
Yeah. And so I'm like, it's pronounced Rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't know how to pronounce the name of the course, you probably haven't ever been to it. Right?
Yeah. The epitome. That's a good one. Yeah, what do you guys think? Anybody, you can put your hand up if you want. You can think about it for a second. Yes, gentleman in the back.
I think it's kind of kind of like what this speech kind of is under. You know, rhetoric is what I believe is kind of like the analysis of what it is, what it's trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always so evident in the speech. You kind of have to look between the lines a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, excellent. Yes.
Using words to persuade somebody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Yes.
Like the conversation surrounding a topic.
The what? I'm sorry?
The general conversation, discussion, just surrounding a topic.
Okay, yep. Like the discourse conversation on a topic. Very good. Anybody else? These are all very good. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like last time was the study of like miscommunication everywhere.
Yep, study of miscommunication. Very good. I.A. Richards, stand in the back there. We're not going to talk about I.A. Richards, but I like that definition. I.A. Richards was a British rhetoric scholar, and he said, why do we call it communication? We never study communication. When someone's like, hey, can you hand me that pen? And you're like, sure, and give it to them. We don't write a book about that. We always write about a book like, hey, can you hand me that pen? And then like, you know, an airplane explodes. And we're like, okay, what happened? Like, that's what we write about. We always write, so he's like, it should be called the study of miscommunication. So that's the interesting part. So you can always find miscommunication and its remedies is what he, and I got made fun of as a new professor in my department at St. John's because we were renaming the department. And I was like, we should rename it the Department of Miscommunication because that's what we really study. And everybody laughed until they realized I was serious. And then I still don't have any friends in my department since that
I'm
fateful
still your friend.
day. Yeah, but you're not in my department. God, if you were, that would be something. That'd be crazy. But anyway, all these definitions are great that you offered. Everyone who offered one, you're correct. It's a 2,500, 2,800-year-old study. It's been around for a long time, so it's gone through many iterations. And my impossible task, my Sisyphusian or quixotic task tonight is to take you through this thousands of years of history and kind of give you a little bit of orientation as to what rhetoric could be. I can't do everything, but I can kind of take you through it. What I've decided to do is organize it in 3 different cases or 3 different ways of talking about it, which everyone mentioned these 3 different cases. The earliest one being oratory, the study of words, persuasion, like you said back there. The study of interpretation, like this guy said back there. And the study of making meaning, which is what she said, right? The discussing all the things around it and all that kind of stuff. So these are the 3 cases that we're going to go through, and it represents thousands of years of history. So we're going to start in ancient Greece. We're going to go to this guy who you should know who he is, right here in upstate New York, who's incredibly important to the history of rhetoric. We'll get to him in a little bit.
One of my heroes.
I forgot to bring the book.
Oh.
I meant to bring the book, but this is a great, great, great part of rhetoric history. We're in a place that's incredibly significant for the history of rhetoric studies in the world. Not just the United States, but the world. You're sitting right in. And then where we are now with things that you might not consider related to rhetoric and what they are. But first, we have to go back into the ancient world and talk about the guy who started it all with this definition of rhetoric. I'm going to give you lots of definitions of rhetoric. You might want to write them down because they can help you kind of triangulate where your definition of rhetoric might end up. This is still a living question. People fight about this. Scholars fight about this all the time. What is rhetoric? Fight about it. What's the best definition? Could it even be defined? Does a definition take something away from it? Is it an act maybe or something we do? This definition, the art of identifying all available means of persuasion in a given instance, comes from a long tradition of Greek, ancient Greek, or particularly ancient Athenian study of rhetoric, which is where most of rhetoric in American rhetoric departments, American speech departments, comes from. This comes from Aristotle. You guys know Aristotle? Did anybody tell me something about Aristotle? Anybody got any Aristotle trivia? Like, he loves steak sandwiches, or no? Nobody? Has anybody read anything by Aristotle? Forced to read it? Did you have to pretend like you read Aristotle for another professor? No, you're not. I guess it's still early in the term. You will at some point have to. So Aristotle's called the first scientist. That's his nickname. It's something interesting to know. Maybe that'll work at a bar or a party to get someone to talk to you. You know Aristotle's the first scientist? But you didn't know that. Because he used observation. And when you read his books, they're just lists. They're very boring. Because they'll be like, he has a book called On Plants. He has a book called On Breathing, which is like kind of creeperish, but also just weird to talk. He's like, of the kinds of breathing, there are 5. And of the second one, there are 7 kinds. And the third kind is 2 parts. And this is how he writes. It's kind of like clickbait on the internet. It's like the five weird things you didn't know about your car insurance. Number 3 will shock you. This is how Aristotle writes. So he would have been very happy to write for the internet today with clickbait writing. He wrote a book about rhetoric called On Rhetoric, and it's thought of as a summary of all the different controversies he lived through as a young man, because he was taught by some of the best people. You might know some of this, depending on what your major is. So this is a person you probably never heard of before, but he was the most famous teacher of rhetoric in Athens. His name is Gorgias. And Gorgias was not Greek. He was Italian. He was from Syracuse, not that one, the Italian one. And he was a diplomat most of his career, and he went to Greece a lot, and he thought this would be a fun place to kind of retire and teach. Because Athens was a democracy, as we all know, but did you know they had like trial by jury, but they didn't have attorneys. You had to represent yourself. And if you charged somebody with something, you charged them yourself. You would grab them and bring them to the court, and they'd have a jury of 201, or later 501 as the population got bigger, jurors you'd have to convince. They also had the death penalty. They had all kinds of penalties. You have to pay a fine, but they also had capital punishment as well. Drinking hemlock, which we'll get to in a minute. But Gorgias had a job as what we would call a sophist. The sophists were professional teachers of rhetoric who you'd go to and say, hey, I've been accused of a crime. I need help defending myself. Will you help me write a speech in my defense? He'd be like, yeah, you got to pay me. Pay me this many drachma and I'll help you out. Great. And he was very well known for it, but he was also known as a performer. He would drum up interest in his art by doing kind of what we might consider to be something pretty familiar. He would say, I'm going to give a performance of Aristophanes' The Birds, which is this very famous poem about birds. He's like, I'm going to be doing it live at the Acropolis. The tickets go on sale tomorrow, and people would just line up. And then he would go in there and he'd do this rhythmic reading of a poem, sometimes with music, sometimes without, and everybody would be like, this is my favorite part. This is something you've participated in, but just with much more electronic stuff. So he was kind of like known for his like flow, I guess. The way he sounded, he had a great accent, people reported. The way he spoke Greek was really like Antonio Banderas or something. Like this. Think of somebody whose accent you really like and who you like to listen to speak. And because he was a foreigner. And all the teachers of rhetoric are foreigners. And they made a lot of money. He was very wealthy. He drew the ire of some of the most famous controversialists in Athens. Here's Socrates being in David's artistic representation of being given the death penalty for being accused of corrupting the children of Athens. The people of Athens put Socrates to death. And you read all about that in the works of Plato, who was Socrates' student. So Socrates taught Plato. Plato was against Gorgias, but Plato ended up teaching Aristotle. So that's the connection. So Plato wrote a dialogue between Socrates and Gorgias after one of these rock concerts where he'd be like, you know, my new mixtape is dropping on Tuesday. Actually, he had a very, very famous original composition that we still have a copy of. It's so famous we lost most everything from the ancient world in a very famous event called the burning of the Library of Alexandria. You might have heard of that, right? We lost almost everything. But we have Roman authors and Greek authors referring to works that we don't have. But this one was so famous, there's so many copies of it, it survived. So the things where there are tons of copies of them survive into the future from the ancient world. So imagine you're in someone else's ancient world right now, because you are. What's going to survive? Harry Potter, right? There's so many copies of it. Think about how many copies of Harry Potter there are. In the far, 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 far future, some students are going to have to plod through some translation of that because they won't be speaking English. They'll be, God, this is so boring. I hate this. But it'll be one of the few things they know about our culture. And one of the few things we know about Athenian culture, we have this thing. Gorgias is like, I got my new concert, original material, next Tuesday. It's called Encomium to Helen. And you guys know who Helen was from antiquity? Yeah, tell me something about Helen.
Helen of Troy?
Huh? Yeah, Helen of Troy, yeah. What do you know about Helen?
Trojan War?
Yeah? Say more. She fight the Trojan War?
No.
She responsible for the Trojan War?
It was like two guys wanted her. She was the girl.
Okay, that's a very fair. An Athenian wouldn't say that. She's responsible for the Trojan War. Yeah, kind of a slut, kind of a bad person. Nobody's naming their kid Helen in ancient Athens. They're not. And Gorgias, an encomium, is a speech of high praise, incredibly high praise. So it's like, wait, he's going to give a speech of praise about Helen? I got to hear this. What could he possibly say that would be good about Helen, who caused the Greeks to fight a unified 14-year war against the Trojans because she just wanted to go and hook up with Paris, who's described as hot. If you ever go read the Iliad, get a translation where they describe everybody's little names. Swift-footed Achilles, noble Hector. Paris's little things like attractive Paris, hot Paris, super sexy Paris. Like, this is how he's described, right? Everyone has a little description about them. And there's a movie with Brad Pitt where he doesn't play Helen, even though he's very attractive. He plays Achilles, right? So, but anyway, he writes this thing. He's like, we should praise Helen because it was either the will of the gods, or she was deceived, or she had this terrible stuff happen to her. He goes down all these different reasons and kind of got the Athenians to kind of say. And then at the end, after they were done applauding, he's like, everything I just said, I don't believe it. I just did that to see if I could change your mind. Just to see if I had that ability. Because I serve a powerful Lord. I serve rhetoric. I serve rhetoric. And rhetoric is an incredibly effective and powerful thing. Here's Gorgias, what he described rhetoric as. It's translated speech in this translation I got, but I'm sure he said rhetoric, which is the Greek word. The word rhetoros in ancient Greek means an orator. So this is very much the speeches of persuasion kind of thought about rhetoric. Rhetoric only appears in Plato's writings, which is where you change the ending, you change the meaning of the word. It means rhetoric is a thing. So speech is only said in this dialogue, and this comes from Gorgias using that word, rhetoric, a thing. They didn't have that concept of that in their language. Language shapes a lot of how we think and a lot of how we perceive reality. I don't know if you've seen that movie, Arrival, about the aliens and the ink circles and all that. So there's something to that does come from common theory. They took a lot of liberties with that, but there's something to language shaping reality and what we think is true or not. And it was very much at play in ancient Athens, where Gorgias is saying, look, speech is the most powerful thing. It's so tiny, I have the power of a god. And people are like, I want that power. And he's like, of course you do. $29.95 a month. You can subscribe to Gorgias Plus, and you can stream all of my content, but it's not really streaming. I'll be live in the Agora, and you can come and I'll teach you. And there were tons of these sophists. And Plato wrote diatribes against all of them because he hated them. He thought they were doing terrible, terrible things to democracy, because they were teaching people how to make things that were real seem real that were not real or good. And that's Socrates' critique of the sophists, a critique of rhetoric, actually.
They're like liars.
Yeah, I think that's what he'd say. They would say they make what appears to be good seem good. And so they asked Socrates in the dialogue, Gorgias, what do you mean by that? It's like, well, it's sort of like being a pastry chef. You make some stuff you're never supposed to eat that will poison your body and make you sick be the only thing you want to eat. Like a Pop-Tart or like a cream puff or something like that. It's not like if you actually want to know what to eat, you go talk to a doctor, is what Socrates said, right? He's like, it's also the difference between being someone who sells cosmetics and someone who's a personal trainer. What does a healthy body look like? There are these standards of beauty that the cosmetics person, and that's what a sophist is. And Gorgias is like, you're funny. This is the stuff that runs the world. I mean, you can have your opinion, Socrates, but this runs the world. And if you're not familiar with it, you're going to get owned. Right? And the word he used to define rhetoric was this Greek word. I didn't write in Greek or in Roman letters. Pharmakon, which you should recognize. We get an English word from pharmakon. What English word do we get from the Greek word pharmakon?
Comic-Con.
Comic-Con. Very good, Sam. No, Sam's wrong. Pharmacy. And what do you get at a pharmacy? There you go. Drugs. Well, medicine. But pharmakon is actually the ancient Greek word for drug. But they don't distinguish between drug like weed and also poison. and medicine. It's all one thing. But if you think about ancient medicine, that makes sense, right? Like, yeah, eat this root. I hope you survive. Should make you feel better. I don't know. But the ancient medicine was kind of dicey, right? So that's kind of the way it went. So pharmakon means a drug or a poison or a medicine. We're not sure, because of problems with English translation, what Gorgias meant, but that's what he called rhetoric. It's a pharmakon. So he's like a drug dealer, in a way. And this is the earliest definition of rhetoric we have. These people were running Athens, pretty much. They were the people that everybody went and consulted. In fact, the most powerful political leader in Athens had a woman named Aspasia, who was Theban, who was a sophist and a master of rhetoric. And she wrote a lot of his speeches. It's not clear, but a lot of people in Athens thought so. They wrote political commentary and they wrote plays kind of pointing this out. And she does appear in a Socratic dialogue when Socrates is remembering back to being young, and she approaches him at some state function. He's not dancing, and she's like, "Why are you not dancing?" He's like, "Oh, I don't know the dance." And she's like, "Oh, if you're Athenian, you have to know how to dance. That's how things work around here." It's kind of a telling kind of way about how Plato saw Aspasia in politics and things like that. So I'm spending a lot of time on Greece. They really did shape the view of rhetoric. They over-determined the view of rhetoric because of things that are going to happen later in this country, which they couldn't even imagine, but in European history as well, is that Aristotle kind of comes up with this kind of solution between Plato and between Gorgias, saying, well, rhetoric is something we use sometimes to get people to move their ideas, but it's not something that we want to shape the entire world with. Gorgias would disagree. He's like, there's no alternative to this, is what Gorgias would say. You're kind of stuck. This is the way it is. But and the Platonists, Socrates and Plato, would say, well, the only way we should communicate is through dialectic, which is this annoying kind of questioning technique called the elocution that Socrates is known for, where it's like, oh, would you define courage for me? Oh, and that definition, so I don't know about that definition. Do you think would this fit under your definition or this? And he walks them through until they get to a contradiction. He's like, so, as you can see, you don't really believe that, so try again. People are like, Socrates, I have to go to work. Like, I cannot be doing this all day. Like, he didn't wear shoes, he rarely bathed, he ran around the mall all day and bothered people. You know, they're like, why are you buying that? I need it. Well, what does it mean to need something? It's like, no, Socrates, not today. I gotta go home, I got kids, gotta get my kids from soccer, or whatever the Greek equivalent is. This kind of thing.
Today
You know,
that's
pick up
called the
the collar.
Socratic method.
Yeah, it's called the Socratic, the elocution, yeah, the Socratic method. So Aristotle is kind of like someone who benefited and is really historically known for kind of finding a middle way between these definitions. And he came up with this definition, which is a weird one, because you notice he doesn't say in here it's about convincing other people or changing people's minds. All it is for him is an art of identifying all the options you have to persuade somebody. It's not beating them, it's not tearing up their arguments, it's not having the facts. It's nothing to do with any of that. The arguments of persuasion are about identifying every pathway you can have in any instance where you want to change others' minds. So I think it's something that gets overlooked when we think about rhetoric is, what's the capacity of it? Is there a step back, or is it always like scorched earth? Is it always winning everybody with good arguments? Is it like being that great criminal defense attorney, or that great prosecutor, or that great politician that you admire? Whoever you might admire, you're thinking of as good as rhetoric, is good at rhetoric. He's just saying it's about finding it all. So, two things to think about Aristotle's definition. It's a productive art, and it's about creating things. This is going to change. We don't think of rhetoric today as a productive art where we're creating something. But that's what the sophists thought, and that's what Aristotle carries through in his definition in his book Rhetoric, which you can read for free. You can just Google it, and you can read the whole thing. It's pretty interesting. Some of the examples are a little weird because he's talking about, battles in history that you wouldn't know, but he's talking to his students at the time. And then also famously, nobody mentioned this, but he was the teacher of Alexander the Great of Macedonia, Alex of Macedonia, which you might know from history, whose father, Philip II, hired Aristotle to teach Alexander. And so people suspect that Alexander was so successful because Aristotle taught him rhetoric. We don't know that, that's a suspicion. I like that idea because it makes my field look good. Might not be the case. So, we're going to do some another thing Aristotle's famous for is this division of rhetoric that I'm going to show you very quickly. In rhetoric, he says there are 3 different kinds of speeches that you can give. Only 3. He makes lists, like I told you about. Forensic, which are speeches about the past. We get the idea of forensic science, what happened. But also judicial rhetoric, like criminal law, is also called forensic disputation, traditionally, which is this idea of how we figure out what happened in the past. Epideictic, which is about the present, ceremonial rhetoric, like It's the first day of school, the president of the university gives an address, or it's the 4th of July, your local representative gives an address. It's or if someone gets married, you give a toast. If you're the best man or you're the maid of honor, you give a toast to the happy couple and you give a little speech. That's epidictic.
Eulogy?
A eulogy, yeah, a eulogy, which is which they called well, there's several. An encomium can be a eulogy. The Greeks would call it panegyric. So if you find that word, it's a very special kind of eulogy. The only for many years I was like, it's hard to find an example of this in English rhetoric. But when Senator John McCain passed away, Barack Obama gave a eulogy that is like a panegyric, which is like this speech where it's like, well, his family will miss him, I will miss him, but you don't even realize how much you'll miss him, oh Americans, right? You don't even let me give you a taste of this person and how missed they will be. And that speech is a very powerful speech. If you haven't seen Obama's eulogy of McCain, it's a very good example of this classical kind of Greek panegyric, I would say. I don't know what people might say about my interpretation of it, but that's what I think. And then deliberative speech is about the future. You guessed it, about what we should do, what policy we should have, what kind of action we should take.
Just a quick thing on that. Do you know what my official title here is at Cornell University? Oh, great one? No, that's not right.
Court jester.
No. I got promoted from court jester. Do you know? Yes.
Director of Forensic.
Yeah.
Forensic Studies.
Yeah, my official title is Director of Forensics. And when I first got here, they're like, I went to parking and they said, what's your title? What do you do? And I'm like, I'm Director of Forensics. And they're like, ooh, we better give you a good parking pass because you probably have to carry like bodies in and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, they need someone to solve all the murders here at Cornell. So I let them think that, and I got a really good parking pass that year. Then they found out, and now I'm like way out in the A-lot. But it worked for a little while.
Yeah. There's like, in medicine, there's pathology and there's forensic pathology. That's the distinction, right? It's like, pathology is study of disease. Forensic pathology is what happened here, what happened in this body. Which all of our television is full of this now. All these shows, CSI Ithaca premieres in a couple of weeks. Every city has a CSI now.
They follow me around.
They just sit around drinking coffee. They're like, I wish somebody would get murdered. Oh well. So Aristotle is also famous for coming up with these 3 modes of proof. He has other modes of proof, which he calls non-artistic. But you've probably heard about these before. I would suspect in an English class or writing or something. These are the modes of artistic proof, and the difference is these are the ways to prove something when you don't have hard evidence. They're equal for Aristotle. He's not saying one is better than the other. That's a modern bias we have because we've been through the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. He didn't have any of that. So he's like, well, there's laws and there's testimony and there are historical documents, and those are good. But if you don't have those, what you can do is you can come up with reasons. Logos, this is the Greek word for word. Logos, but it also means reason. Logos is just explaining reasons and using common sense or shared experiences. Ethos is using credibility. This is the Greek word for home as opposed to house. So this is explained when people talk about, like they're on the campaign trail and they talk about eating at the local diner or eating at some local place, or like, you remember Beto O'Rourke when he ran for president? He had that weird Instagram of him just eating food at different local places. He just kind of took that out of control. It's like, I'm one of you. This is like, I'm one of you. I know how you feel and how you think. George W. Bush, the former president, hired an accent coach to help him pronounce things for the Midwest differently than they do in Texas. So instead of saying the United Nations like we do in Texas, he said United Nations like they do in Ohio. And those kind of things he thought gave him a psychological edge. And so did Karl Rove.
Yeah, and Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton also had a dialect coach too.
Yeah.
Because accents are a great way. One of Aristotle's students, I forget his name, was obsessed with accents. And he tried to master all the different accents of Athens. Athens was like New York City. Different parts of the city had a different accent. You can tell where someone's from by how they talk, pretty much. He goes, oh, you were from the Bronx, you were from Brooklyn, this kind of thing. You might be from New York, you might not understand that. But we all see it in movies and TV all the time. And he went to somebody who's like, can you tell me how to get to the Parthenon? And this woman's like, what is this, a trick? Are you trying to scam me with that accent? I know you grew up right next to it. He was like, yeah. Trying to like trick her with a fake accent. So Aristotle was a student of this too. So ethos, you can think, this is translated as credibility, but it doesn't have the same meaning as credibility today. It's a very different thing in the ancient world. It would be more like, I'm one of you. We're all together in this. I know where you grew up. I know the land. I know the people here.
Trustworthiness.
Trustworthiness, yeah. And then pathos is emotion. like things like patriotism, anger, or more powerful ones like indignation. Like, I can't believe we have to do this. I can't believe we're even having this conversation about student loan debt forgiveness, right? We see a lot of indignation in the press today about this, right? People are trying to get people riled up, and that's pathetic proof. We get the word pathetic here, we get the word ethics from this, we get the word logic from this. These are the Greek cognates, which they don't really mean in English what they mean in ancient Greek, but still kind of interesting how language is shaped. Our language is shaped by all kinds of different languages, and Latin and Greek are very present in English. All right, so we're about to leave the ancient Greek world behind. These are what are called the Canons of Rhetoric. And the Canons of Rhetoric are the different things that, as Aristotle's work became more prominent, as Greece moved from democracy into the Byzantine era, and then we move into Rome, these are the things you'd study in school. This is all you'd study. The place that science, hard science, has in the university today, in the ancient world, rhetoric had that place. That was the one thing you would all study. It was considered to be the most powerful thing. We'd all study because of the influence of Aristotle and other writers. Invention. How do I come up with what to say? How do I figure out my position on this question? Arrangement. What order do I put my ideas in? Style. What language do I use? Not like German or English, but do I use a highfalutin language, as we'd say in Texas where I grew up? Or do you use something more basic, right? Cicero, who we're going to talk about in a minute, was really good friends with Julius Caesar, and he always praised Julius Caesar on styles. Like, Julius Caesar could go in and speak to the Senate and impress them all with his amazing vocabulary. And then he could go talk to his troops, and he told the best dirty jokes I've ever heard about the enemy commander's mom and the things she gets up to and all this. It's great. He could do it all. Julius Caesar could do it all. So get you an emperor he's a 10, bud. You know that meme? Yeah, he's a 10, bud. He crossed the Rubicon. Ancient world memes are
Just
funny.
one quick thing on the style.
On he's a 10, bud?
No.
Okay.
Please ignore that. It's very interesting. I know people that speak Arabic, and they said the best Arabic speaker they've ever heard is Osama bin Laden. He was educated in Saudi Arabia. He speaks like the equivalent of English speakers, like a very fine English, like from England. And so when people hear him speak, they immediately know he's super educated, and he's a powerful rhetor. And so people are like, how come Osama bin Laden was able to get all those people to follow him? They're like, you don't understand, you just think Arabic is Arabic. But there's all kinds of Arabic, and he is the creme de la creme of Arabic. You know, when you hear him speak, anybody that speaks Arabic hears that they stop, because they're like, that's some nice talking.
Yeah, that's cool. I didn't know that. Delivery is how do you use your body, your voice, your gestures, your position in the room. And memory is how do you remember everything that you have to say, which today we don't have to worry about because we have laptops, we have our phones, we have notes, we have pens and paper, so cheap. But in the ancient world, they were not.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
They're going to be taking the test where memory will be very important.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. But they had to memorize. Yeah, but you don't have to memorize like a 3-hour speech, you know, and you don't have anything to write on. Like they had wax tablets in Rome. Like they would have these speaking contests under the emperor. I think it was Nero. Nero was really fond of oratory contests, and they would use a hot nail, like in a candle, on a wax tablet, kind of like a Etch-a-Sketch, but it had like borders on it, had wax, and they'd write their notes. And the losers would have to erase their speech with their tongues, which would take a long time. It would probably cause some abrasion. But this is what the emperor would make them do if they gave a bad speech, like eat your words, you know, kind of thing. But kind of like painful to think about. But yeah, if someone gives a bad speech, you can like
or a bad presentation.
Lick that monitor, lick your laptop screen till it goes away. It's like holding down the backspace key. Okay, but anyway, we don't have to worry about this so much. But a lot of times these days, rhetors or rhetoricians talk about memory as being the lost canon. But they also talk about it as things like public memory. Like how do you make people think of a space or a place as having this intense kind of shared communicative moment or memory or emotional connection to make your speech true.
What technology do politicians use now instead of memory? Teleprompter.
Yeah.
Right? That's like the whole thing. Like George Bush couldn't learn how to read on the teleprompter, and so he would like move his head like with the words.
Oh.
And so they brought on all these experts. You look like you're reading. You're moving your head like this, and you get to the end. Stop doing that, and he could never do it. Whereas Obama is a master of the teleprompter. You never think he's reading anything.
Yeah. One of his speechwriters, I think, Obama's speechwriter, just wrote a book, I think.
Yeah.
And there's a great photo of him for NPR, of like Obama looking at a draft of a speech and correcting it, standing there, and the speechwriter's just like super nervous. I was thinking about that. I was like, man, Obama correcting something you wrote for him to say, that would kind of put you on edge, right? It's kind of like, kind of
We actually have a group here, a student group called Advocacy Project.
Oh, okay.
And they had that speech writer come and speak to them.
Oh, very cool, very cool. I think you just wrote a book, just came out.
Yeah,
I haven't read the
I think
review.
that's why he came.
Yeah. Very good. Well, it's a good reason. Buy my book. All right, now we're going to go into some very quick history. We're going to go through Rome and then through early modern period very quickly with these four figures who I picked mostly because these pictures are awesome. But Cicero is probably the most famous Roman. You might have seen him on television treatments or film treatments. He's a very, very, very famous Roman attorney, very, very famous writer about rhetoric, and he kind of picked up and made more rhetoric-y where Aristotle left off. He's famous for saying that Aristotle did good things for philosophy, but he's going to take and run with that with rhetoric, because he was an attorney. Rome had attorneys. Rome had courts of law where professional advocates would represent you in front of a judge, which they called a praetor, and they would do everything from civil to criminal matters, and attorneys would represent them. Cicero also worked in the government too. He was one of the consuls of Rome, which is one of the highest levels of that, and then he was eventually killed when it changed to an empire. For they thought he was dangerous for the things he was saying, and he was also people looked up to him. He was very eloquent, very good speaker.
Here's a trivia question for you, Steve.
Yeah.
I challenge you. What was Cicero's nickname?
Tully. Yeah, Tully.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thing. People that live around here know there's a town called Cicero, New York, named after him. But there's also a town called Tully, also named after him. They're all right around Syracuse, which is also an ancient name. Right?
Yeah, you might be familiar with hip-hop superstar Alexander Hamilton. You know this guy? He's very famous for rapping in New York. I don't know that much else about him.
Yeah.
But in the old letters of Hamilton and Madison and John Jay and Thomas Jefferson, we have all their correspondence. We know what they thought about each other, writing back and forth, and they write to other people and be like, check out this letter I just wrote to this idiot. Some of them didn't really like each other very much. But they are always referring, when they're talking about the Constitutional Convention, and Washington gets on board, which to the surprise of everyone. But it's Hamilton's influence, really, I think, that did that. They're always talking about developing a kind of a society that Tully talks about. And they're talking about this in the letters. And if you didn't know who they're talking about Cicero. Cicero's understanding of rhetoric was for the benefit of the republic, res publica, the public thing. This thing we all come together and that allows us to live our lives, the republic. And they wanted to found a republic. Lots of people harp on that word when they're talking about American democracy. And that was what the Founding Fathers wanted. They based it on Rome. They based it on the ideas of Cicero, who they studied in school, and they learned Latin from reading Cicero and translating Cicero, which is very difficult to do if you've ever studied Latin. He's one of the most difficult writers to translate. But he had a lot of ideas about this, and his idea about rhetoric is that rhetoric should serve this res publica, this public thing.
I studied Latin in college, and I had to translate a little bunch of Cicero, but there's no C sound in Latin. It's K, so it's Cicero.
That's right, yeah, Cicero.
Yeah. And so my favorite quote, and this kind of sums up, he's kind of a harsh Roman. This is, he said, vita est supplicum. Life is punishment. That kind of sums up his philosophy. I'm like, oh, that's cheery. Yeah. Let's read more.
That was a pretty popular philosophy among Romans at the time that we know, Stoicism. It's pretty popular on YouTube and the internet, like Modern Stoic and all these emails. Yeah. So a lot of people follow this stuff and listen to modern philosophers on YouTube and other social media about this. But Stoicism is around the same time that Cicero was living, which is around Julius Caesar's time. They were good friends. And there's a lot you can read about this guy. Quintilian came much, much later at the end of the empire, which is why I put them together. He was at the end of the Republic. This is at the end of the empire. Quintilian, aside from dressing like an absolute unit and having the coolest style imaginable, emerging out of a yellow cloud of God knows what to talk to you about rhetoric after not having shaved for 8 weeks with his red hat and his beady eyes. Quintilian got a government grant to write books about rhetoric, and he wrote a 14-volume work on rhetoric called Institutes of Oratory. It's like if you want your kid to be a Roman senator, this is what you do with them every year as they're growing up. This is what you do. This is how you teach them to walk. This is how you talk to them about being scared. This is how you teach them about friends. This is all this stuff. And famously, he said, anytime you're speaking, you want to speak with the confidence that you have a fully armed Roman legion behind you to enforce your words. It's not really getting the audience on your side, maybe. I don't know. It's like kind of like, yes, sir, this kind of thing. But he said that famously. And he's the one who said that rhetoric is a good man speaking well, which is an interesting kind of definition. It's a very sexist definition, but we're dealing with Romans, right? Good man speaking well. That's something that comes up in rhetoric quite a bit these days, the idea of who's allowed to speak. And that's something that came up in the 20th century. We're still dealing with that. Is it worth studying an art form that was limited to just certain kinds of people? And certain kinds of identities? Something interesting to think about. Quintilian wrote this book. It was presumed lost. They found it in some monastery in the basement. They're like, oh, we found it. It was just kind of laying around down there. Otherwise, we wouldn't know anything about it. He got a government grant from Emperor Vespasian to write this book, and he did it. He was a rhetoric teacher just like me. St. Augustine, one of the early fathers of the Catholic Church, Bishop of Hippo, North African guy, not looking kind of like some kind of weird off-brand Mel Gibson or something here, like the Mel Gibson you get off Wish.com or something, I don't know. Weird picture of him. But St. Augustine was a rhetoric teacher and very, very, very familiar with Cicero, very familiar with Aristotle and other works, and teaching that in Rome as a foreigner. And he was like, man, teaching sucks. The students never pay attention. They always ask for extensions. I hate it here. I'm going to go do something else. And then he decided he converted to Christianity. He became one of the early church fathers, and his message to the church was, you can't just force people into this. You should use some persuasive techniques. We have all this stuff here. So he was one of the early advocates of what I guess we would now know. He's not a Jesuit, and he's far removed from that, but the early advocate of that, of like, let's adapt the Christian Catholic message to the groups that encounter. And that's what he wanted to do in the early church. So he said rhetoric has three primary functions. This is probably the clearest definition of rhetoric you're going to hear tonight. To teach, to please, and to move. That's what St. Augustine said in his talking about rhetoric and how it can help the Catholic Church mission. To teach, to please, and to move. Which I think sums it up pretty well. I use it to teach. I use it to make you happy. And I use it to get you up and out and go do something. Change your feelings, change your heart, change your mind, change your attitude, change who you're going to vote for. It's all there. Francis Bacon came along much later. He was an Englishman, 17th century, very well known in science, super famous guy, wrote a bunch.
Great breakfast meat.
Yeah, inventor of the most famous breakfast meat in the world. No, not really. No. Francis Bacon, he said rhetoric was the application of reasons to the imagination for the better moving of the will. That's a very fancy definition. The application of reasons to the imagination for the better moving of the will. That's what he thought it was, and that's what he used when he was doing his courtly stuff, and he's an early scientist and all this stuff. So you can see rhetoric is moving quite a bit as we go through, thousands of years of history very quickly here. It's changing its attitude quite a bit to something, but it still has that idea of being productive. It still has that idea of being something we make, and it's also creating a lot. It's creating attitudes, creating thought. It's creating the way people see the world. All of these people think it's something that generates worldly stuff. All that's about to change. Also about to change with the big bad guy of rhetoric who comes along in the 17th century.
Two just quick things. Back to that last slide, if you could go back to it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So these are kind of interesting asides. Do you know why this part of New York has a name of all these like famous Greek and Roman places and people? Like central New York. Yeah, way in the back.
Well, I mean, I think it's in Greece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
who's the king of Ithaca?
But there's a, I live in the town of Ulysses. Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, do you know who the king of Ithaca was? He's one of the most famous in the Greek myths. Odysseus.
Oh.
Yeah.
King of Ithaca. Silver-tongued Odysseus. But they also call him Polytropos and Polykolos, which are adjectives for the octopus. He can change his shape and change his color depending on what he needs to do. He's like an octopus. That's what they say in the Iliad,
very interesting.
in the Odyssey. So he's the only one who can talk Achilles down. And Achilles is like, I'm taking my man and I'm going home. And he's the only one who can get him to stay for the war. Because they need him, because he's a demigod. He can't be killed. So you kind of need that guy. You're going to fight a war, right? So like, please go talk to him. And Odysseus is like, okay. I'll go talk him off the ledge.
Yeah. So the answer is in like the 1830s, 1840s, the guy in the map office in Albany was a classic scholar. And so local people would be like, we want to name our town Skunk Hollow. or swampy, smelly woods. And they're like, no, you are now Rome. You are now Romulus, right? These are all towns around here, by the way. And they had like, you know, stupid names. And he's like, there's no way in hell I'm going to sign off on Smellyville as a town, right? I'm going to call you, you know, some fancy Roman name. And so that's why we have all these names right around here, because they thought these people were too dumb to pick their own names. There were a few exceptions. For example, I live in a little town not far from here called Trumansburg. And they said, from now on, only true men will be, no, that's not what they said. They said, the guy's name was Treeman, T-R-E, like Treeman balls, but he couldn't spell very well. And so he filled it out, and they're like, okay, Abner Truman. And like he didn't realize that he constantly spelled his last name different ways. So there actually is no one named Truman that Trumansburg is named after. It's named after a guy named Treeman. Same guy that Truman Falls is named after.
Oh.
So, but that was the educational level they were dealing with. So you can imagine the guy, he's a trained classics scholar, and he's like, these guys can't even spell. I think this place is going to be called some fancy Greek name, right?
Yeah, I think when they describe Ithaca in the ancient myths, it's like, it's really rocky, it has lots of cliffs.
Yeah.
It's like bad weather, you know, it's like the guy knew what he was doing. You know? It's like, whoever this guy was in the office, like they're like, only Odysseus could be the king of this hostile, mountainous, rocky land where your wrong step, you go plummeting into a gorge.
Yeah, but the funny thing that happened was, in 1900, there was this great influx of Greek and Italian immigrants. You all know about, you know, Ellis Island and all that. And so they get here, they get to Ellis Island, and they look at a map of New York State, and they see all these Greek and Italian names up here, and they're like, our people, they're up there, let's go. And so there was a lot of people that moved up to upstate New York that were either of Greek or Italian ancestry because they thought that those places had been named by Italians and Greeks. But they got here and they're like, there's no one here, but we might as well stay. Yeah. It's funny how the world works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Both are funny.
Yeah.
I agree. So we're about to get to the end of this era of rhetoric, the big bad guy, Peter Ramus, who doesn't look like Darth Vader, but a lot of people consider him the Darth Vader of rhetoric. He's the person who studied rhetoric and then turned on it, wiped it all out, Order 66, all that stuff. So the Revenge of the Sith kind of thing, which is a great film. So Peter Ramus was French. He was killed by his students, actually. It's a weird bit of trivia.
Don't get any ideas.
He was grading papers, and there was there were lots of, in early modern French history, there were lots of fighting over religion, like there is in a lot of early modern Europe in general. There's Protestants versus Catholics. The students came in, they accused him of being one or the other. They picked him up and threw him out the window while he was marking, he wasn't on the first floor. They threw him out the window, and he died. But he's most famous for writing his doctoral dissertation about Quintilian, who I just told you about. And he wrote about Quintilian, and he said, the perfect rhetoric would be to have no rhetoric at all. Wouldn't it be nice if I didn't have to dress up my words, and people could just see the world the way I did? And then people would just, if I presented the facts, if people would just accept the facts, wouldn't that be a great world? We're still kind of living in Peter Ramus's world in a lot of ways, unfortunately, where people are like, why can't you idiots just accept facts? Why can't you just believe this stuff? Just people don't work that way. But Peter Ramus is the first person to kind of advocate this. And he ended up really taking rhetoric to an entirely different consideration that would last from 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, all the way into the 20th century. And even in the 20th century, rhetoric is still taught in these kind of ways that Ramus predicted, which is elocution. Rhetoric's function is not to create anything, it's just to make things sound a little bit more acceptable. But using fancy words, it's almost Socratic in a way. Using fancy words isn't going to get anybody on your side, you might get them to do something bad. So let's let science and philosophy come up with the truth, and rhetoric will package it. And this leads to the teaching of elocution. I have two examples of it here. This is from a textbook I actually own from the early 1800s. And this is what you'd be studying in a rhetoric class, is gesturing. Look at these crazy things this person does. And then in the last one, they're suddenly in a robe. I don't know why. You'd have to have a costume change just for the last one. But all these things like doing like this and gesturing like that, these are the ways you're supposed to do because they literally believed that the position of your body would put people in a position to listen to you. So I do something like this and it makes you consider my point more seriously. Or if I stand like this, you'll start to feel sad. There's some psychological stuff related to this, like neuro-linguistic processing. You might have heard this, NLP, where it's this idea of like Skinnerian, like B.F. Skinner. You know who B.F. Skinner was? Behaviorism? Anybody psych major? Yeah, B.F. Skinner. He taught chickens how to play baseball. Great YouTube video if you haven't seen it. Type in chickens playing baseball. He was like, all animals react to classical conditioning. I could teach chickens how to play baseball. And sure enough, there they are. They go up, they bat. When they realize they got a hit, they run the bases. The other one goes and gets the ball, rolls it back. I mean, they know what to do. And he's just doing it through food, through positive and negative reinforcement. That's what Skinner was known for. And Skinner said, all creatures, even human beings, are like this. If I just nod a certain way, you'll look at me more. Like now I'm speaking to you. If you're giving me positive feedback, I'm going to look at you more. These are the things Skinner kind of was famous for. He called it behaviorism. He was like, everything in the world should work this way. And this is, before Skinner, this is the way they thought about rhetoric, was if I move my body in a certain way, I can get you to actually feel these things. Here's another great image from elocution. This is from the 20th century, from Penn State. Look at this professor. Is like, he'd be fired today, but he's like, here's how to move your mouth to say the words correctly. He's like pushing on her cheeks. Look at that. And like, this is obviously her friend who's either cringing or laughing. I can't tell. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe the professor is grabbing her jaw. But maybe they could, I don't know. But it's like, here's here, it was all about pronunciation, and there was a correct way to speak, a correct way to pronounce things. That not because of colonialism or any of that stuff. I'm sure it's embedded in there, but just because there's a right way to speak, just plainly, and that's the right way to speak is to reach people.
And
that's what they thought.
It's physical. It's including the way you move your jaw, the way you move your lips, everything.
Yeah.
And if you don't do it that way, you're doing it wrong.
You're doing it wrong. And that was it. And there's nothing about coming up with new ideas or rhetoric's ability to shape or to find ways into each other's mind, rhetorically to shape reality. We're far removed from the sophists here in the, I guess this would be the 1940s Penn State. This would be 19th century. There are people working on rhetoric in other ways. I don't have time to go into all the detail. But this is the popular main way of thinking about is elocution. It's just how you say it is the only thing that rhetoric is with. And we still have that definition today when politicians say, well, we don't need rhetoric, we need action, or we need new ideas. We don't just want rhetoric on the problem. They're referring to the elocution movement, which they understood just to be nice words, or good sounding words. And we're kind of still stuck with that definition in a lot of ways. Peter Ramus did a lot of damage in the way, not just him, but the way he's interpreted. But it might not be completely him. Some people try to recover Ramus, and they write some pretty good scholarship about how he's a little bit more sensitive about Quintilian than we give him credit for, but it's still a good turning point where his influence really took off, just the same way Aristotle's influence really took off and shaped rhetoric.
Just a couple quick things about elocutionary movement. I've actually seen like a video, like an old film, like from the 40s or 50s, of a Harvard professor, like working with the students, and they have them like, the student like attached to these sticks.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, I've seen
the student's giving a speech, they've memorized a speech, and the professor is moving their hands like a puppet. Like, oh, you're supposed to do this, or, put your hand out like this.
Yeah, it's like there's all kinds of like,
yeah.
I put it to you, like this kind of like,
Or
it's
if
overwrought. We would consider
if you
overwrought.
put your hands over your heart like this while you're talking, that means that you're sincere. Stuff like that.
It means call the paramedics.
Yeah.
If I'm talking and I go like this, it means call the EMS.
So, there's a big debate. I would love to hear what you think about this, Steve. I've never asked you this. So, Lincoln's Gettysburg's Address.
Yeah.
Lincoln would have known about these gestures. We never think about it. We say, oh, he gave this certain speech. But do you think he was using these gestures? Because that's what good speakers were considered to do in 1860.
It's a great question. It's a great question.
Yeah. Like, it's a very short speech, right? 70 years ago, right?
But Lincoln was known for this. He was known for giving these like terse, like, the day calls for us to do this thing, and as the president, I'm here to do it. And everybody would kind of giggle. He'd be like,
yeah.
then he'd go back to the office.
But do you think he's like gesturing? Like, we never think about that, right? But that was considered good public speaking back in those days. He had been trained in that.
I would say he probably didn't do it. Yeah.
We don't have any pictures or anything.
Yeah, we don't have any recordings, but from what everyone talked about, he had a very terse style. Now, his style when running for Senate in the Lincoln-Douglas debates was much more animated. But he was being accused of that if he got elected to the Senate, Stephen Douglas was running against him. And Stephen Douglas was the incumbent, but it was also a three-way race, because Stephen Douglas was against the majority of Democrats. President Buchanan said, we're going to support. So there were two Kansas governments applying for statehood because of Stephen Douglas. He invalidated the Missouri Compromise, which Henry Clay had fought for just a few years ago, which was anything below the southern border of Missouri. If any territory down there organizes, it'll be a slave state. Much more important than Democrat-Republican was whether you're slave or free state. Do you permit slavery or do you forbid it? And that was the balance of power in Washington, right? That was the balance of power. So Henry Clay said, let's just draw a line. Missouri will organize. Missouri can be free. Anything south of Missouri, slave, right? So Kansas forms, and Douglas says, well, it should be up to the people whether they're free or slave. Popular sovereignty, and that's what he was famous for. The Illinois Senator. So they get to vote. So then they had two referendums in two different cities. And the people in Lecompton wanted to organize Kansas as a slave state. And President Buchanan said, all Democrats will vote for that. And Douglas was like, I don't want to vote for it. And they're like, bro, it's your policy. You caused this. You have to, I'm not voting for it. He fought against it. So the Democrats ran another Democrat against him, which is the only reason the debates happened. Because the Republicans were a nothing party. They were a one-issue party. Abolition is the way they're interpreted. That's all they really, that's their only platform. Lincoln was a Whig. He had served in Congress as a Whig. And he didn't, you know, the Whig Party was dead pretty much on the slavery question. They couldn't figure out a good answer to that as a national party. And so he just was, I guess I'll be a Republican now. There's nowhere else for me to go. And so then you have those debates. And in those debates, he raised his voice. He made jokes. People would heckle him. He'd heckle them back and get a lot of laughter from the audience, even from the Douglas supporters. He would get very animated. But I think as president, maybe he didn't do much of that. But he had been, you're right, he had been trained in a very famous book called The Columbian Orator. It has nothing to do with Columbia. It's like funny, the Columbian Orator. It's also the book that Frederick Douglass learned to speak from. They both studied this textbook, The Columbian Orator, which you can get for free on Google's a wonderful thing. You go look at it. And what it is memorize these famous speeches. Here's how to pronounce things. It's very highly elocutionary. It's like, here's how to properly pronounce things. Cadence, rhythm, tone, volume, pacing. This is how you win an audience over. It's all the mechanics of speaking. It's all that. But Lincoln was very terse and very... But he was also a huge fan of Shakespeare. We have his Shakespeare book. It's at the Morgan Library in New York City. There's tons of annotations in his hand of writing about that. In meetings, he would randomly pull out Shakespeare quotes. People talked to him. But William Seward, his Secretary of State, was frustrated to death with Lincoln. Have you seen the movie Lincoln, the Daniel Day-Lewis? That's a very good depiction. Very good depiction of William Seward. Like those people from the countryside come to appeal to Lincoln about something, and they're like, could you please not... Seward's in there having a meeting, and he's annoyed that Lincoln wants to talk to these, like, farmers. And he's just smoking his cigar, and they're like, my husband has emphysema, could you not smoke the cigar? And he's just like... Right? He has no respect for, like, regular people. He's like this elitist. But that's why I think why Lincoln liked him.
Cool
Seward was a New Yorker, right? He's a New York senator. Right?
You can go to his house. It's about 30
Yeah.
miles from here.
Yeah.
It's a museum now. It's in Auburn, New York. It's really cool. The cool thing about Seward...
He wouldn't want you in there, though. Not dressed like that.
No, but you can go now. He's dead. Right? But literally, he was, you know, his friend with Ezra Cornell.
Oh, yeah.
And so you can go to his house about 30 miles from here in Auburn, New York. It's a museum now. And it's interesting for a couple different reasons. Partly because Harriet Tubman's house is right across the street. So she was doing the Underground Railroad right under his nose, probably with his permission, but him not making a big thing about it. And then he has this gigantic, she has like this shack, and he has this gigantic mansion. There's a museum now. Her house is also now preserved. But Auburn was like this big, important town back in the early days of the New York State and also the U.S. Because it was an industrial town. It was on the Erie Canal and all this other stuff. But the interesting thing about Seward that a lot of people don't know, when Lincoln got assassinated, there was a simultaneous attempt on Seward's life.
Yeah.
But the guy tried to kill him not with a gun, but with a Bowie knife. And what he did was he slashed him across the face. And so later pictures of Seward is a gigantic scar across his face. And he was never quite the same after that. But the famous thing that Seward is known for is, because he didn't die, right, obviously, but but it was coordinated with John Wilkes Booth. It was another guy. Exactly when they do it, they attack it at a certain time. But
it was like a coup.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about Seward is he bought Alaska, and yeah, from the Russians, and they called it Seward's folly. Everybody's, why are you buying that stupid godforsaken land? You know, he spent $7 million on it.
Yeah, a lot of money in those days.
Yeah. And people are like, what is wrong with you, Seward?
What's the other name they call it? Call it Seward's Folly, but what was the other name?
I don't know.
Seward's Icebox.
Oh yeah, that's a good name for it too. Anyway, the Russians want it back, and we're not going to sell it back to them because they found out there's a lot of oil there, and it's where we put people like Sarah Palin.
I thought we'd get through tonight without a Sarah Palin reference, but I was wrong.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is where rhetoric ends up in the 20th century, but things are looking pretty grim. The school of rhetoric has been taken over by the worst of the dark arts. Terrible, terrible, but there will be one small hero who will save us.
Oh, nice. Should we take a break?
From here.
Should we
He
take a
even
break?
looks like Harry Potter. I'm getting there. He even looks like Harry Potter. Right here at Cornell University, the elocutionary movement will be undone after the break.
Nice. Oh, let's take a break. That is connected with Cornell University. Steve, take it away.
All right, so welcome back. Second part, you might have some questions. It's a big class. You might not know each other. Put this up here. You can ask anonymous questions at this website that we'll get to at the end of the talk if you wanted to. If you're scared to put your hand up and ask a question.
But please don't be that way. We're our friendly family here. We want you to be
I don't know.
engaged and ask
Do
questions.
you trust each other yet? I don't know.
Yes, they do.
It's like day 2.
They do trust each other.
Okay.
Okay.
By royal
Yeah.
edict, you trust each
Yeah.
other.
And then the other thing is Steve will be hanging around afterwards
Huh?
to sign autographs and maybe a copy. Did you bring your book? You can't buy a copy of his book, but other things.
Maybe.
He'll talk to you. Like, you know, sometimes people like after class, this is the cool thing about having an in-person live lecture as opposed to a Zoom person, right? You can go and have a little chat with him afterwards about whatever you want, you know. Hey, Steve, do you like dogs? I like dogs. You know, whatever you want to talk about. He's a very interesting person to converse with. And I actually think that is where the most interesting stuff happens. After class, when you hang out with the speaker. That's one of the things that the Zoom virtual thing killed. Like, that never happened, right? People just like, okay, gone, out of here, deuces, right? That doesn't happen anymore. Yeah, do you know what that means?
Yeah, I do.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so this is the hero, Cornell University English professor Herbert Wilkelms, who taught here at the beginning of the 20th century. And he started getting interested in rhetoric. He was an English professor. And English is mostly dominated by this thing called literary criticism at the time, which is, how do I know a poem is good? How do I know one poem is better than another one? How do I know this story or this novel is better than this other one? It's still kind of the questions to deal with in English today, except the canon of what counts as a novel, a poem, or a story has exploded. And a lot of English professors have fled to film, which is like kind of cleaner, but not for much longer. As the internet kind of takes that over. What's a filmmaker? What's a film? Does YouTube count? It's just kind of like dissolving into the postmodern soup of scholarship, which is really fun, or you might hate it. I don't know how you feel about postmodernism, but anyway, all these...
Just sorry to interrupt, you can be a serious English professor and study like comic books.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and people
Or
are like,
manga. Like at Harvard, they have that manga as literature class.
And,
People
but,
are
you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, no one would ever do it.
But in 1920, it's definitely not what he studied.
Yeah, and I have a friend that's an English professor at the University of Rochester, and she taught a class called Sex with Robots in the English department. I'm like, okay, that wouldn't be taught back in the day. I wonder what the people that trained you think about this. And she's like, who cares? They're dead. You know?
Wow. Okay, so anyway, in 1920, he's not teaching a class like that. So he's here, and he had some interesting ideas about rhetoric that he came up with this idea of something we're going to be talking about for the rest of the lecture tonight, rhetorical criticism, which is something he kind of came up with. He's kind of the godfather of it, which is the idea of how do I tell if a speech is good? So we're moving from elocution, which is making a speech sound good and look good and appeal to the masses, and we're moving away from it's something you make, to now it's something you consume and interpret. And for most of the history of the United States and the colonies, people got speeches all the time. They got it through newspapers. You know, early America was incredibly literate. So many people could read, even people who weren't supposed to know how to read could read. And you would read these speeches in the newspaper. And then with the advent of radio and things that are coming out this time, people are hearing these speeches. So speeches are something that Wilhelms is thinking about, and he's looking at printed speeches from history. He's like, you know what, I think we could do literary criticism on speeches. He called it rhetorical criticism. In 1922, he wrote an incredibly famous paper in which he said these things, that it's analytical. Speeches are important. They're not just elocution. Throughout such a study, one must conceive of the public man as influencing the men of his own times with the power of his discourse. So it's important to think that speeches are made to influence other people. And that seems like kind of an obvious point, but remember, we're mired in elocution. Speech doesn't mean anything. It's just a delivery of truth. It's like, it's your Amazon box. Maybe you'll keep it and use it to send something to somebody else or mail something back or something. It's really just a package. It doesn't have any more value than that. Wilhelms is trying to get us to see that. So in his paper, he went back to Aristotle. Right back to Aristotle. You should recognize these from what Aristotle came up with. An early rhetorical criticism was, what kind of speech is it, and what kind of proof do they use? And here's Lincoln for you, Sam. The Cooper Union engraving, Cooper Union speech in New York City. Effectiveness is the goal. So I can say, is in a deliberative speech, he used ethos, was it effective? And this is what early rhetorical criticism was. Like, let's look at this speech and let me explain as a scholar why I think this is effective based on Aristotle. In fact, Wilhelms was so well regarded, people came here to study with him. And there was a thing for a period of time in the 20th century, early 20th century, called the Cornell School. You know, there's all these, the such and such school, the Frankfurt School, right? The famous German Marxist scholars, right? There's like the Hudson River School of painters, you know, paint the Hudson River, right? Paint nature. There's the Cornell School. You probably haven't heard of that one until tonight, but that was a school of rhetoric and rhetorical criticism, and it was a very popular place to come and study, and Wilhelms was honored. I have a book that was published at the time of his retirement. I forgot to bring it, but it's a picture of him as an old guy in there, and his students, who all became very famous rhetoricians, wrote tribute essays to him and published this book when he retired in the 1960s. So he had a long and prosperous career here, but I don't think there's a Cornell rhetoric department.
There's not. In fact, the last vestige of the Cornell School of Rhetoric, which was the most famous school of rhetoric in the United States, at least probably in the world, is this class.
It's all that's left of the
The last 50
Wilhelms
people
tradition.
left in what was once this great thing that produced all these great professors in the field of rhetoric, and we are the last thin line keeping it. And of all things, Wilhelms would be spinning in his grave if he knew it was in IOR. Oh my God. He'd be like, where is it? In arts and sciences? At least make it
The finest of the liberal
in
arts.
the College
What?
of Human Ecology. No, it's in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. That's where they now study rhetoric. He'd be like, what happened to the world that went mad?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, but even people in my field don't really know who Wilhelms is. But he's really responsible for getting people interested in rhetoric. And we might depart from him, but it's important to know, well, there's much more famous figures than him. But he's the guy who sort of started people thinking, well, maybe there's more to rhetoric than just sounding pretty or elocution, beautiful words. Like that's what they called it in Europe, the beautiful words movement.
There's a guy around, his name's Corey Earle, does anybody know him? He teaches a class in the history of Cornell. He's one of these guys, he's like 4th or 5th generation Cornellian. His dad was a professor, his grandpa was a professor, and now he actually works for Alumni Affairs and Development, but his hobby is studying Cornell history. And so I asked him once, and he teaches a class, you can take it, on like the history of Cornell. It's fun. You learn everything, every little weird thing about Cornell. He knows it. And he's a young guy, so I highly recommend it. But I asked him once, I'm like, can you tell me the history of study rhetoric at Cornell, because I know about the Spokans guy. And originally, it was a whole separate field, like, you know, the Department of English. It was called the Department of Oratory. And then what happened is they merged with the Department of English. And so it was called the Cornell Department of Oratory and English. And then the English people got sick of the oratory people. And they're like,
Still happens.
You're stupid. You need to go somewhere else. And so they changed their name to Speech, and it became the Department of Speech and Theater. And then the theater people got sick of the speech people, and they kicked them out. And guess where they kicked them to at Cornell? The College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. They were like, those people over there that learn about cows and stuff, they have people called extension agents that need to go out into the field and teach farmers about the next best way to raise a cow or grow corn. And they need to know what you guys teach. So you are now in the College of, it was called the College of Agricultural School. And so that is why the Department of Communication is in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Isn't that weird? So, you know, it's been a weird, it's always a long, strange trip. And now, I used to be in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the Department of Communication, but in 2008, when the financial crisis hit, I came to ILR. And so now the last vestiges of rhetoric are now in ILR. And then when the next big crisis comes, I'll probably be in like the cooking school or something. Yeah. Or maybe the hotel school, who knows what.
Snow removal.
And I'll be like the rhetoric of cooking. And I'll be inviting Steve, and then we'll be talking about sausages.
The rhetoric of cooking is good. That's what Socrates called Gorgias. He's like, I teach rhetoric. He's like, well, what is it? It sounds to me like cooking. You just kind of like, you don't really care if it's good or not. You just make it taste good. It's like a knack. It's like something you can kind of do good. Socrates making fun of him.
Yeah.
Gorgias is like, no, it's the most powerful thing in the world. He's like, I don't know. Sounds like you just make donuts. And you probably shouldn't ever eat a donut. It's probably not a good thing for you to eat ever. But you want to, and you like it, and you probably eat that
Tastes
over
good.
a kale salad.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Socrates is like, we should make kale salads over here. Anyway, so one of the most famous students, and this is a big change from Wilhelm's saying, what rhetorical criticism is determining if a speech is effective. This really starts to blossom well beyond what's called Neo-Aristotelianism, which is let's just take Aristotle's work and use it as a critical frame. A lot of problems with that. Aristotle wasn't thinking about the consumption of speeches. He was thinking about how to make people good speakers in the assembly or good statesmen, good people to run their country, good administrators. And that's what he was teaching at Plato's school. So Edwin Black is the first to notice that he said, we can take this evaluation of speech a bit farther. He wrote this incredibly famous essay, The Second Persona, in 1970. So he moved ahead about 50 years from Wilhelm's. But Wilhelm's is still around. He's recently retired. He probably read this. And Black said that we got to take a lot more responsibility when we critique a speech. We have to look a bit deeper. And the second persona is not, let's not just look at the words of who they said it to who, but let's look at who they imply the audience is when they speak. Every speaker has a vision of who they're talking to. And if they're not careful, they could create a horrific kind of person. A mob, a mass. They could be speaking to the worst of us. And we might move in that direction because their words are so persuasive. That's what the second persona is when I speak to you, I can address you and I can say, students. Or I can say, Cornell students. Or I can say, upstate New Yorkers. And with varying degrees of your attitude about where you fit on that sliding scale will change. That's just the basics of what Black is saying. I can invoke in you a kind of a passion or a feeling or an identity that could be quite bad, and rhetorical critics need to be able to judge that morally and say, that is the wrong way to characterize the people. You're going to get a bad result. Here's a quote that is predecessor, 1970. 1970. In the discourse of the radical right, as with all discourse, we find enticements not simply to believe something, but to be something. So this moves it away from that Aristotelian logic or propositional argument, if you think of it that way, or reasons. And now we're dealing with something more along the lines of identity. Who I am, who I want to be, how I communicate, how I tell the story of myself to myself and to others. How I dress, how I style my hair. All of these things start to become communicative under Black's definition. All these things become rhetorical. What t-shirt I choose to wear. All these things are meant to show who I am, and a good speaker can take advantage of these things. The critic can see in the auditor, implied by a discourse, a model of what the rhetor would have his real auditor become. What the critic can find projected by the discourse, the image of a man, and through that, though that man may never find an actual embodiment, it is still a man that the image is of. The condition makes moral judgment possible, and at this point in the process of criticism that can be illuminatingly be rendered. We know how to make appraisals of men. So he's using sexist language there. I think he means mankind or people in a way. He's not just talking about men per se. A bit of a product of his time. This is a very interesting quote because the critic can say, look at the words they're using, look at how they're communicating, not just the propositional content, but how they're talking to them and who they assume they are. People might want to gravitate towards that identity. And that's the start of the second persona, which is a very interesting concept in rhetorical criticism, and an interesting way to think about rhetoric is going well beyond just words and their denotative meaning. Now we have context, now we have society, now we have sociology and psychology in the mix because of Ed Black's work.
So you take in account everything.
Everything. So the way a speaker addresses somebody and what they assume, who's listening to them, and the assumptions they make about who's there, people will, if the speaker is good and people are reacting, they might kind of move them and be like, I'm going to behave that way.
Yeah.
I'm going to behave that way. It's like identity, which becomes important later on to this guy. This little munchkin-looking guy is one of my favorite people ever. So, this is Kenneth Burke, who Sam talked about at the beginning of the thing. Kenneth Burke asked important questions. He's working at the same time in the 40s, 50s, the same time that all these people are working contemporaneously. These are the kind of questions that Burke started to grapple with. Is rhetoric really as simple as, I'm going to give you the facts and the evidence? Is it really as simple as we've been taught through elocution to believe? Do people hear reasons and go, oh, that's good, I'm going to change my political beliefs now? Is that how it works? I don't think so. And he wrote a ton of books about it. Kenneth Burke, called Rhetoric Identification. And this is probably the most important definition that people are still using today for rhetoric. Rhetoric is identification. I use rhetoric, bless you, I use rhetoric to identify with who I want you to see me as and who I think I am. And people use rhetoric all the time to communicate to others who they are. And he had a very complicated formula of this that he wrote so many books about. If you go to the Cornell University library, you'll find Kenneth Burke's books are in every liberal art. He's in history, he's in sociology, he's in anthropology, he's in English, he's everywhere. He was an autodidact, he's a self-taught guy. Lived in New York City, wrote literary criticism, was friends with poets and thinkers, and not formally educated guy.
Had no degrees.
Had no degree, he's from New Jersey, lived in New Jersey most of his life. He died in 1993, lived a very long life. His sons kept his house preserved because he's so important for scholars, and I know scholars who've been to his house, you can make an appointment, and the sons will let you, they're like, we left every piece of paper the way he did the day he died. And so people are like looking through it, and his filing system doesn't make any sense because he was autodidactic, he was self-taught. So he'll have these like weird files about like whipped cream recipes and then a story about a shark attack, and they're in the same folder, and it's like, what was he seeing there? You know, weird stuff. But people are looking for manuscripts and other things because he's a very important thinker to rhetoric.
That's how I want my house kept.
Funny trivia about him, he was working at the time of the Red Scare. You know the Red Scare, 1950s, McCarthy, all that. And he was a communist. He's a member of the U.S. Communist Party. So he got blacklisted from all the universities that were right-wing. He couldn't work there. But the communists, the left-wing universities would hire him. But then he went to a big American Communist Party conference, and he gave a paper about rhetoric where he's like, hey, you know what's a really dumb idea? Calling Americans workers. Nobody in America wants to be a worker. Do you know what everyone in America is? Middle class, no matter how much money they make. Maybe we should say that instead. And they were like, you are an affront to Lenin. You were dismissed from the Communist Party and banned forever. So he was banned from the Communist Party, and he was also on McCarthy's list. So what do? Well, you do the only thing you can do. You go work at Bennington College in Vermont. You know, where people major in like pottery and things like that, and making dream catchers and stuff. And he taught there for a long time. But he also became quite famous, so he made a lot of money lecturing, and he published books. And he was really, really good friends with the New York City poet William Carlos Williams. I'm sure you all know, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater beside the white chick. It's probably his most famous poem. Everybody who takes a high school literature class knows that William Carlos. Well, they were very good friends their whole life. And William Carlos Williams was a doctor in Paterson, New Jersey, and it was right down the road, so they hung out quite well. So yeah, that's his idea of rhetoric is identification. He wrote 3 books about it, maybe 4 books about it.
Bennington College, by the way, the answer to the most expensive college in America.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, don't go there. Stay at Cornell.
Well, if you want to go to the most expensive college.
Yeah. Actually, I don't think any of his papers are there. All his papers and stuff is at Penn State now, which he oversaw that move when he was still alive. And they put a sculpture of him there, and they tried to make the same face of the sculpture. It's a very funny picture. He went to the dedication. So here are his definitions of rhetoric. The realm of the subsidized lie. That's a very good one. To subsidize something means that you make its market value a lot more accessible. So that's kind of a cool definition of rhetoric. The scramble, the realm of cloaked malice. And rhetoric is forever proving opposites. So he saw rhetoric as this continuous process of trying to prove the opposite of something. You say something, it's like rhetoric emerges when you try to prove the opposite of it. It's kind of like this process that you move through. So I would say that Burke gets us to this very modern concept of rhetoric as the study of how we make meaning, how we fight over symbols and what they're supposed to mean and what they actually do mean and what they could mean. And we do that all the time in our political lives, in our pop culture lives, in our sports lives, in everything that makes life worth living. We're always fighting about the meaning of particular symbols, right? What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? Oh, it means this, and if you don't think that, then you're socialist, right? This kind of stuff, right? This is what this means. If you don't respect that symbol, oh, this symbol doesn't mean slavery and hate. It means self-determination and pride. You know what symbol I'm talking about immediately, right? Let's say something like that, right? So this is the thing that Burke was interested in. He kind of opened up rhetoric to that. So he said rhetoric is a compensatory move called identification/division. When I identify with something, I'm automatically and maybe not even intentionally dividing with all the things that people might see as against that. Right? So you think of Colin Kaepernick kneeling on the football field. You remember that? Is that too old an example? This is still kind of in our collective consciousness. He's identifying with something and he's being very clear about it, but at the same time he's dividing with all these other meanings and generating a lot of hate. So what does this symbol of him kneeling actually mean? This is an identification division move that we could study under Burke's theory. Now this is very hell and gone from Aristotle, right? We're very far removed when we're talking about that as rhetoric from oratory. We're very far removed from logical argument. But this is the kind of thing that Burke opens up to say, well, this is rhetoric. It's any move where we try to identify symbolically with things that we want to be a part of, or we want to be a part of us. Consubstantiality, he says, is the goal of all human beings, which is, I want you to think that I am this other thing. I want you to think I'm associated with this. I want you to think of me as cool. I want you to think of me as associated with all these kind of ideas that you also might think is cool. I want to push my own being and identity to be this thing that you also would like. And that's what rhetoric is about, is trying to be consubstantial. It's a constant struggle because everyone's always trying to figure out somebody's motive. You're trying to figure out my motive. Like, what do I really want to say? You know, like, you're like, why is he here? What is he doing? Is he really like? What's he really like? You know, or if we see somebody doing something, yeah. You're trying to figure out Sam's motive. Right? What's Sam about? You know, like, and figuring that out is like really good if you have big rhetorical challenges. Because like, an easy rhetorical challenge is just doing the logical part. Like, so if I asked you to describe the difference between Tinder and Hinge, could you do it? But I can change it. I could. You know, this is a bad question, right? But I could make it even harder. I said, can you explain the difference between Tinder and Hinge to Sam, to where he would get it? Right? It's a very different question. So this is the kind of level of rhetorical identification division that would be very difficult to accomplish, I think, depending on the context, right? Because everyone's trying to figure out, what is your motive? What is that person about? Once we figure out someone's motive, we can have an attitude towards them. If we know that person is a jerk, or we know that person is an idiot, or that person is evil, then we know we should shun them, we should stay away from them, we shouldn't get into business deals with them, whatever. This is always moving around because of consubstantiality, identification, division. The person whose motive you thought you might have sized up will say something in the press or do something, and you'll be like, well, that's out of character. Maybe I should change how I feel about them. Right? This is what Burke outlined, right? He's like, we're always constantly looking at people's actions, where they do them. This is the pentad that you're talking about. Where they do them, how they do them, with what, for what purpose, and then we're always changing our assessment of them once we figured out what they're about. This is what most of our political conversations are about. Oh, this is what they really want. This is what Joe Biden really wants. Like the student loan thing is a great example of that. Everyone's talking about the motives of the Biden administration. They say, oh, well, there's a midterm election coming up. This is why they did it. Oh, they did it because it was a campaign promise. So he did it because he can't do more. He can't give more loans, right? And so we should like him. We should hate him. We should think of him as slimy. We should think of him as dumb. We should think of him as an inappropriate president. He should probably resign, or whatever people are saying. There's so much discourse. We're just producing it all the time. It's all in this model. All in this model.
Do you think this has to do with cancel culture as well?
Yeah. So it's hard to uncancel somebody. Right? It's hard. So I guess the best example of that, if you wanted to study that, is I'd say, look at the J.K. Rowling stuff, because people really want to cancel her, but they also don't. Because they just love the hell out of Harry Potter, right? So does that mean you have to burn your Harry Potter books? You can't enjoy that stuff anymore? It's like tough. It's also, for other people, it was the Guardians of the Galaxy guy or whatever. He made all those AIDS jokes or whatever on Twitter. The guy who directed Guardians of the Galaxy, and so Disney fired him. And then Dave Bautista was like, who's kind of a Republican right-wing guy, was like, well, I'm not going to do any Guardians of the Galaxy if that guy's not doing it. And then they asked Chris Pratt if he would do Guardians of the Galaxy. He's like, I have to pray about it, because he's like a crazy Christian guy. Right? I'm going to go ask God what God wants me to do. As if God cares if you're Star-Lord, dude. Come on. But that's what he said. And then they uncanceled the director of Guardians of the Galaxy. through this process of identification, motive, and attitude. So this is the kind of stuff you could write about as a rhetorician now. You don't have to write about boring-ass speeches. You can write about Guardians of the Galaxy. People publish this stuff.
Please, don't
It's pretty wild.
denigrate boring-ass speeches.
Well, I like
People
them,
write
but
on-
I mean,
on speeches.
the field is wide open, and it's because of Kenneth Burke's influence, and it's even wider than that now. All right, so let's do some traditional speech analysis. Donald Trump, January 6th. This is circulated quite a bit. What was January 6th? What was that day? What happened on that day? We're discussing that. There's hearings about it. What occurred? I thought we might do a little rhetorical analysis in a very traditional way and see what you could bring to bear on some of the things that Trump said. We're going to look at the last paragraph of his speech, the last closing remarks, see what you think. And I put them up here in text. So here's the first part of it. Is there anything that stands out to you as worth the attention of rhetorical criticism based on what I've told you about Burke, Ed Black, or Will Cones?
Something to focus in on.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the textbooks they call it a curious artifact.
Do they?
Yeah.
Oh, what textbook are you using?
Foss.
Oh, okay.
I don't know, I feel like he's saying we, and it's sort of identifying his audience as someone who loves America and someone who's a good citizen, and so it sort of forces the person who thinks they're a good citizen to align with the crowd trying to storm the Capitol.
Yeah. This is just before that happens, right? So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is the speech he gave, and then at the end of it, you see he says, here, I'll fast forward a little bit. So we're gonna walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. It's a great avenue. People have been telling me it's a great avenue. I think it's great. People have been telling me, you know how he talks, right? He has the most interesting way of speaking, I think, of any president we've ever had.
Yeah.
It's just bizarre. It's just loops and loops. It's like a roller coaster, right?
Yeah.
But he said, I love Pennsylvania Avenue. We're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give, which is weird, but this is exactly what we're talking about. So they're about to do the right. But the question for the commission is interesting because they don't have any trained rhetoricians on the January 6th commission. But they were looking at the speech and trying to find ways to connect it to say he knew what he was doing. He was inciting a riot. So this is interesting that you bring this up because he's saying we have truth and justice on our side. Now, if we look at that in a Burkean way, as this enormous crowd shows, we have truth and justice on our side. First of all, the size of the crowd is a sign of truth and justice. Interesting. There's so many people. They're the majority, maybe. That's what he means. There are people out there who do not have truth and justice on their side. It's everybody who's not in the crowd. Who are the people he's been talking about for an hour? The people in the Capitol certifying the vote. They're not out there. They're in there. Inside-outside divide. So you can see how this is building. That's great. Anything else you want to say? Or are you done? Maybe you'll have something to say on the next slide. Okay. You might have something to say on the next slide too. Anybody else want to say something up here that strikes your attention as a rhetorician? Sam?
I'm very interested in the word we.
Yeah.
Because we is very powerful. Have you ever been standing next to someone and you're just sitting there, they're talking, and all of a sudden they throw their arm around you and they say we? And all of a sudden you're like, you're agreeing with them, I guess? Like you're now part of a team and you were just sitting there? So we is a way to like capture people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like we're all in this together. You're a team now. Teamwork makes the dream work. When you say the word we.
Yeah, that's it. He didn't say Republicans have truth and justice on their side, right? That's interesting. Because, I mean, that could be divisive. There might be people there who don't identify as Republicans. Or the term that Trump coined, rhinos. Do you know this term? Republicans in name only. Rhinos. Like, they're not true Republicans. Republicans in name only. They're Republican. They're fake. Like the governor of Georgia, who's a weak idiot. In this speech, he really gets
It's funny there's rhinos, but there are no dinos.
Yeah.
Democrats in name only.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah.
I think those are called blue dogs.
Blue dog.
Yeah,
Oh,
they are
yeah,
called
yeah,
blue
yeah.
dogs. And that's for a really interesting historical that reason. It goes way back.
Yep. Blue dog Democrats, very good. Yeah.
Or limousine liberal.
Limousine liberals, yeah, that's a good one too. Limousine liberals. Don't they have like country club Republicans? Wasn't that one too?
Yeah.
People said that about Rick Perry. They like country club Republicans. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking about too is like how you were saying when you state something in rhetoric, like automatically there's this like opposition that you're building, and so he uses like extremely vague language. Just like generally when he speaks, he uses extremely vague language, like overwhelming pride in this great country, like you know, or like truth and justice. Like there's no opposition to truth and justice, but like, but if you were to say like the truth and justice of like our court system or something. You know, you might build an opposition because you're going into like a specific truth and justice. But so that, I just found that.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because I mean, I think we love our country. It's hard to think of someone being like, "Well, I'm running for president because I hate the country.
Yeah,
I want to divide it up and sell it to China." Here we go. But he is creating an opposition to say, well, this automatically raises suspicion that there must be people out there who don't love it, or who claim to love it and don't, right? Who don't actually.
To add on to that with the vague speech is determined to defend and preserve our country. We are determined to do that. Well, how are you doing that?
Yeah.
Is it by rioting? Is it by peaceful protest?
Are we going to go kill them?
Yeah.
Like, we're determined to defend and preserve government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which is constitutional, but also not what's happening down the street.
Yeah.
They're going through that constitutional process, but it's not the people doing it. It's Mike Pence counting fake votes cast by illegal immigrants. Right? The speech is very interesting. It just goes and goes and goes and goes, and it repeats itself quite a bit. So I thought this would be the best point. That's a really interesting point. Yeah.
Honestly, the clearest opposition that I see in like this specific speaking is like we and them.
Yeah.
Like that's the most clear contradiction that I can like define, rather than like any direct action policy or like platform. It's always just like we, but they like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's always that
that's like,
identification division is always there.
Yeah, I feel like he's intentionally like keeping everything else vague and then just making it like, you know, this is really the greatest like contradiction is us and them.
Yeah.
And are you us or are you them?
Yeah, to open it up a bit, you know, we could say from Wilcomb's point of view, we could say, well, this is all like pathos, like riling them up emotionally in a speech that's meant to be epideictic. It's like the transition of power, but it's really deliberative. What are we going to do about this fraud? There's no way I could have lost this. There's no way I could have lost it. We had 71% in all these states, and then suddenly we didn't. There's no way I could have lost it. So it becomes this deliberative, and also kind of it's mixed. And then we look at Ed Black, and we can say, well, what kind of person is Trump creating here? An angry person who's willing to do anything to protect their country. That inducement to become, not just to believe. So it's very different, I think, to say, well, the election had problems and was insecure and fraudulent. That's an argument that you could disagree with and create an opposition to. But you can't create an opposition to, like, we're the kind of people who love our country overwhelmingly, a country run by the people, not government elitists, and we're going to defend it because we have overwhelming love for it. He's kind of creating this kind of revolutionary figure through that Ed Black inducement to become something, not just to believe something propositional. And then finally from Burke, we have the divisions, the consubstantiality operating here between what's their motive, what's our attitude towards them, and then what are we going to do? What's going to be our judgment here? Yeah.
Do you think these kinds of like examples of rhetoric, which I kind of would think classify as demagoguery, do you think these are intentionally designed to kind of infiltrate the subliminal minds of the listeners, or is this just kind of how a guy like Donald Trump speaks, you know?
Yeah.
The way he is.
It's a great question. The demagoguery question, there's a great book on this by Patricia Roberts Miller called Trump and Demagoguery. It's good. It's really short. You'll read it in an afternoon. It's like 200 pages, very quick. And that's that question. I don't want to spoil that for you. But the question of Trump being a demagogue is an interesting one because it gets into something that most contemporary rhetoricians like me would say we don't study, which is intent. We have no idea what he really thinks he's up to. All we can look at is the words and the context, and we can say what we see. But that actually, I think, makes for a much more powerful criticism because we're just dealing with what everyone has access to, and even the things we've said. We said, look at what we're seeing operating here. It doesn't matter if Trump meant to do it or not. The January 6th Commission is meant to see if they can charge him for a crime, and that's what they're looking at. But we don't have to do that. We can say, well, just look, even without intent, look at how dangerous rhetoric can be if we don't pay attention to it, if we're not concentrating on the different ways it induces us to change our identification. This isn't a question of facts. This isn't a question of the wrong facts or blue facts or red facts. This is a question of identification. As serious as any of the debates we're having about identification in terms of trans or queerness, sexuality, whatever you might have it, as serious as those conversations, it's all there. Because it's not something you can propositionally disagree with. And that's why we have so much trouble propositionally disagreeing with it. Because we're like, oh, well, we're the good guys in politics. We use facts and logic. And that'll get you maybe you get 2 minutes of conversation. And this is why. Because they're being moved at the level of identity. This is the insight of Burke. Yeah.
I think what's really interesting about Trump's rhetoric specifically is how he's positioned himself in an identity that isn't his own. That he's this like revolutionary against the establishment that has directly benefited him and that he controls.
Yeah, and he gets off on that. He's like, I give money to both sides. When I was a businessman, I give money to Democrats and Republicans. You remember in the primary debates, he would say, well, I gave you a bunch of money, Chris Christie, for your campaign. I gave you a bunch. I give money to Hillary, too. I gave money to Bill. Like he said it in the debates all the time. So he kind of plays it off again. But contradiction and logical consistency don't really win you a lot of arguments. They really don't.
I have a question about consubstantiality.
Okay.
Right? Like you were saying with like the Colin Kaepernick example, I got a little bit lost there. And then this example, what motive are we examining? Or like which, because like you were saying like you're identifying yourself with something, and then there's the opposition, so it's divisional, but like are you analyzing the one that they're opposing, or like are you analyzing his rhetoric and his motive, like Trump?
Yeah.
Colin Kaepernick. You know?
It's a good question. I would say I'm doing all of it because it all comes out in like, what is Kaepernick doing? So you could say, well, Kaepernick reported this to the press, and this is what his friends say he said he was doing, and this is how it was interpreted by different people when he did it. And then all those different things will come out. Consubstantiality is just for Burke, is the human action of saying, I am like this. I'm so like this that you could merge us together. I'm on top of it. So it's almost like a style maybe, like in terms of fashion. This is who I am. This is what I believe in. I don't just believe in it, I am this, right? I don't just believe in democracy, I'm a Democrat. I'm a, like, not little d Democrat. I'm like, I don't just believe in it, I live it. We tend to really valorize that in our contemporary cultures. Like, well, what actions have you done? You say you're an activist, you say you support this, what have you done? And that maybe is a way to think of consubstantiality, is to completely identify yourself through your actions, your dress, your attitude, that you are this thing. And then people say, well, they're not really like that because I saw them doing this other thing. And that's where the division comes in and the attitude.
It's interesting. I just got through helping a bunch of politicians that were running for Congress or other political offices. On August 23rd, there was a special election. And so, like, you know, I'm helping them, like, win debates and figure out what to say and stuff. But the debates aren't really debates. They're more like, I did this. I had 23 years. I was a wing commander in Afghanistan. How dare you say I'm not American, right? It's all like these lists of things they've done. And I guess what the voter is supposed to do is say, check, that person's authentic. And I think that person's cool. I always think of this consubstantiality as, remember back when you were in junior high and you showed up like to 6th grade or whatever you wanted to fit in, and you tried to dress cool, and other kids did cool things too, and you're like, man, that's cool, that person's wearing a cool tennis shoe. I'm gonna see if I can get those shoes. And then you're doing all these things to try to get people to relate to you and look at you and look at the symbols, say things, you know, use certain language. All of a sudden, you're in 6th grade, you start using that language too. Your mom's like, where'd you get that word? You're like, you know, whatever. And so, but that's how humans are. Doesn't stop at 6th grade. Just keeps on going forever. Yeah,
according to Burke, his overall theory is dramatism. So you might have heard people say theater is like the mirror of life or whatever. Burke was like, no, life is the mirror of theater. Theater shows us everything we need to know about human behavior. And so you just think of everything as kind of this, like when you go to the theater, one of the funny things, great things about a movie, or one of the great things about a play is what we would call dramatic irony, where you know everything that's going on, but the characters don't know other things the other characters have done. This is the most successful drama, soap operas. This is based on that. Where you're like, but you don't know she's sleeping with 3 of your friends or whatever, right? Like soap operas are great at that. And everything gets reset. The bad guys become good guys and it gets turned around. It's all about this attitude, figuring out why did they have that attitude when I know that they care about this, and that keeps you interested. It's the same thing in politics, Burke would say. It's the same thing.
It's kind of cool to me.
The stakes are higher here
than
in like Young and the Restless.
The interesting thing, which is kind of also like sad, is that we are constantly looking for clues when we're judging people, right?
Yeah.
And what do we look for as clues? Symbols. You know, oh, that person's has a Prada bag. That says something. Oh, they have a Rolex on. Oh, you know, it doesn't look like that shirt has ever been washed. you know, something like that. And then we make these huge jumps in a conclusion, but do they really tell us anything? It's the best we got, right? We like to think they tell us a whole bunch, but probably not.
Yeah.
Probably doesn't really tell us a lot. But we think we can tell, oh, I didn't like here's the thing I hear all the time. I didn't like how they treated that person, so they're not a good person, right? To everybody. Oh, maybe they just had a bad day and they treated that one person bad for some reason, right? But that doesn't mean they're terrible in every instance. But one thing we do in cancel culture is we're like, no, once they did that, done. I can't have it anymore.
Yeah.
It's a great way to simplify things. But it's not a very...
It's a super interesting thing to study because like a lot of rhetorical things has so many good and so many bad elements to it. There's so much good stuff about cancel culture and so much stuff that I mean, it's just like any kind of human move about division, identification and division. You're a predator, that's it for you. You're a misogynist, that's it for you. You're a racist, that's it for you. And so we see that moving back and forth and it's really changing and people are debating about it. It's fascinating to me because I'm not terribly interested in what the right answer is. I'm interested in all the different answers and how they function. And that's what rhetoricians do. So no intent and also not really interested in, you know, whether or not, is Trump really responsible for this? Well, I think you can make a good case, but I don't know. But I think it's interesting to see how the rhetoric could definitely create, like this last part here, it's like, we fight like hell. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Well, I mean, that seems pretty clear what he wants them to do. We're just going to walk down the avenue. And this is our moment. So lots of stuff. And this speech is worth reading in its entirety and watching its entirety, even though it can be repetitive and kind of crazy. Because there's a lot going on here.
I have a quick
this
question
is the end of
for
it.
you, Steve.
Yeah.
So I've heard other people talk, other analysts or critics talk about Trump's speech, and they say it's a certain kind of New York talk.
As George Lakoff said.
Yeah, because he's from New York, and New York people talk in a code that New Yorkers can understand. So they say things like, "Where I come from, we know what to do with people like that," and Trump says that in rallies and stuff, right?
Yeah.
About people in the audience heckling him.
I don't know what should be done with her, but maybe you do.
Yeah, and say something
The
like,
Second Amendment
but
folks,
everybody from
what
New
he said.
York knows that means take that guy out in the back and kick his butt, right?
The
But
best
then
example of this, I think, Sam, is when they're like, he did this and this and this. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't
Yeah.
have any use for a man like that.
Right.
That's kind of like mafioso talk.
Yeah, it is mafioso talk, but
I don't have any
everybody-
use for a man like that. Maybe you
Everybody
do.
knows what
I
he's
don't.
saying. Everybody knows what he's saying, but then when you ask him, he's like, what?
I didn't say
I
that.
didn't say I hurt anybody.
Yeah, right.
You know, like that. And so they're like, well, everybody understands what he's saying. How can you say? But it's like a very legalistic. Like when you call him out, he's like, oh, you know, he
Yeah.
plays dumb.
I never said that.
And so
They call it dog
I think
whistling,
that's
right? In the
very,
press. Dog
very
whistles,
interesting.
yeah.
I think that's very interesting. And I started. It was that you were absolutely right. It's George Lakoff that
Mhm,
tipped
yeah.
me off to that, and I was like, yeah, I know other people that talk that way. Yeah, and they're from New York like you are. Any other New Yorkers
I didn't say
here?
that. Yeah, there's probably a ton of
You know what I mean.
Yeah. So here's the final part of it here. So I want to leave some time for some conversations,
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
We have about 15 minutes, so I'm going to blaze through the end of this really quickly.
Yeah, Blaze.
Just kind of show you where rhetoric ends up after this. So this is the third part of the lecture, which is going to be the quickest part. This is what rhetoricians now look at. That was kind of a more traditional analysis. But lots of things about public memory, memorials, and spaces, and how spaces communicate particular meaning to us the way they're organized. So let's go through this. So the rhetoric of inquiry movement starts at the University of Iowa, 1970s, and it really has exploded, which is the idea that every single discipline and field has its own rhetoric. Science has a rhetoric to it. Sociology and history have a rhetoric to it. And lots of the things we believe to be true are because they're persuasive and they're rhetorically constructed. Here's the Watson-Crick double helix. They won a lot of prizes for this, the theory of what DNA looks like. No one can see DNA. This is a persuasive model that was drawn for your benefit to show you what it looks like. Rhetoric. And we believe that's the basis of all life on Earth, right?
But we've never seen it.
Yeah, brain scans. This is a measure of blood flow to the brain that a radiologist has colored based on where they think the intensities are. If you look at the scan, it's just shades of gray. This is why you go to get an MD to be a radiologist, so you can determine where that line is between the different kinds of gray. But aside from that, this being someone's interpretation of gray, small gray changes, you also have to believe that blood flow increasing to a part of the brain means you're thinking more there. We all believe that. Why? That was persuasive, right? Here's Galileo explaining to a very angry person about the universe and the world being round and all this, and the earth not being the center of the universe. And this is just in history, the way history tends to its own field through historiography about like how did we used to do history, how could we do it better, what were the things that were believed, and all that. So the rhetoric of inquiry movement is still alive and well, and it's the idea that no field has a monopoly on the truth. They're all constructing an argument and a story, or even an identification division about what it is to be a sociologist, what it is to be a literature scholar, what it is to be a biologist, is a construction of rhetoric. Visual rhetoric is a big, hot, new field right now, which is, can pictures make arguments? Can pictures make propositional claims the way a speech can? Could we apply Ed Black's or Kenneth Burke's ideas to these pictures? These are three very famous pictures. Iwo Jima from World War II. The picture that's compared to Iwo Jima, which is called Ground Zero Spirit, which an associate press photographer took on 9/11. And this is Dorothea Lange in the Great Depression. Usually this is just cropped to this woman's face, but I thought I'd show the whole picture here. And it's something to think about. Do these make arguments? Do these make claims? Do these work in the same way speech does? This is not agreed upon. There are lots of people who read against it, say pictures like this cannot serve as a rhetoric, but they can serve as parts of a rhetorical claim. But by themselves, they need a lot of help to mean anything. We can talk about what they mean, but they don't do it by themselves. So it's a controversy that you might want to think about as you move forward. So here's some visual rhetoric from January 6th. I thought I might show you a couple of things that maybe might go counter to that. There's also a lot of words in these too. Here's another one, which is a bizarre combination of symbols here. You know, the Confederate battle flag, the sign of Goliad. I'm a Texan, right? So I know the Goliad battle flag, which was when the Texas rebels seized a Mexican armory in the Texas Revolution, and they made a flag where they put a cannon on it. And the Mexican military was like, "Can we please have our cannons back?" And then they just ran this flag up with the cannon picture on it and said, "Come and take it." Like just a straight up challenge to them. So this is an interesting
That's
visual.
nice Texas lore.
Yeah, and then there's a AR-15 on there. So. Yep.
There's someone there.
I always felt like the rhetoric of that flag in general was really fascinating.
Yes.
Because how, like a lot of times you'll see the Confederate flag next to American flags like that,
Mm-hmm.
which, you know.
I grew up seeing these together.
Right, yeah, they're always,
Yeah.
I always see them together,
Mhm.
right? As if they're complementary.
Right.
But if you went back into 1860, you showed that to someone, it would seem so weird, right? Like, they're
Well, the
directly-
person
that
person flying this
flag
would
is
say,
directly opposed.
yeah,
Should, like, is directly opposed.
yeah,
The
yeah.
American flag. So
yeah.
It's interesting about how to some people the rhetoric around that has changed.
Yeah, it's both to the other one, it's a sign, these people don't have any problem with it, but traditionally, you're right, it would be the sign of other that you're treason,
Right.
you're
Yeah, I mean,
treason, you're
The
traitor.
whole point of that
Yeah.
flag was people fighting against the
That's
United
right.
States.
Yeah, they have a new history.
But they don't see, but people who fly that flag don't see it that way. They see themselves as patriots.
Right, but can they get away from the compensatory division that Burke would say that other people see that flag and they think, oh, you want me dead? You don't think I belong in this country. You would be happy if I was murdered. You would be happy if there was violence done against my body. And that's the way other people will read that flag. So that's the way that's the way it gets pointed out. That's the debate, right? And I don't really think there's much of a debate there. You can't escape the division identity. It's there. So if you identify with something, you're also taking on all those divisions. And some people do that on purpose. The identifying with something because you want the division to interrupt, you want to be consubstantial with the negative, is one definition of what we call trolling. That's what a troll does, right?
It's interesting, you know how they've been taking all these statues down of Confederate soldiers, generals, and all over the South? Do you think, I like to think about the future, will there be someday that Cornell students are like, take down that Ezra Cornell
Yeah.
story, take down
Are you
that
going
Andrew D.
to
White.
cancel Ezra?
Yeah, or Andrew D. White, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
he said some very racist and sexist things. He didn't want women to go to school here and stuff, and should we be like, the noose around his neck and everybody pulling it down and all that? Would that ever happen in the future? Maybe.
I also think it's interesting with the Confederate statues, like everyone knows who these people are and cares so much about them one way or the other. In New York, there's a joke, who's buried in Grant's tomb?
Yeah.
Because nobody even His grant's buried in New York and no one even knows that.
There was a great activist thing, I think it was done in 68 or 69, of the alternative SAT. To show how racist the SAT was, they made one from the other perspective. And the only question I remember from looking at the alternative SAT, just to show how classist and racist it was who's buried in Grant's tomb was a question. It was like A, Ulysses S. Grant, B, his wife, C, both A and B, D, yo mama, and D was the correct answer on the answer key. Just to show that that would be the correct in context answer for that question in certain neighborhoods and in certain areas. Because like the SAT was racist because they would have these questions about crew. Do you know what crew is? Stroke.
Yeah, we have a crew team.
So yeah, so they would give the SAT
It's
to
almost
like
as good as our polo.
incredibly poor people in Alabama, and they would read this thing. They could read, and they'd read this thing about crew. They didn't know what the hell crew was. They would get all the answers wrong because they don't understand, or like croquet, or polo, because it was written by East Coast elites.
Yeah.
That's a huge problem with the early
Or
SAT.
loaves of bread, and they use tortillas at home.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, these kind of things were problems because it wasn't that people didn't understand. They didn't understand the story, but not because they weren't able to comprehend it. They were educated. It was just the cultural context of the writing. The reading samples was way outside of their league. They're like, "What do you mean a ball? You hit a ball with a mallet through an iron thing? What the hell are these people on drugs?"
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all I guess that's a good way to end. Are these people on drugs? All right, no questions here. I'll leave this up. But anyway, any questions, anything you want to ask me, you can do it through here, or you can
Come up and
raise
mingle
your
with
hand
them.
or say something.
Tested positive for COVID.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Let's
All
hear
right.
it for Steve. Coming all the way from New York City.
Yeah, no problem.
I just want to say, wonderful lecture.
Oh, thanks.
Storytelling.